What's up? Welcome to Journey in the South, and I'm your host, Sarah. We're doing part 20 in our series Donald Trump, Outsider or Establishment. And for review's sake, we started this series to bring illumination to the fact that Donald Trump is not an outsider as he purported to be. And we went through the process and continue to go through the process of identifying the connections that Donald Trump has to the establishment, if you will. He came into office under the auspices of draining the swamp to get rid of the so-called deep state, which is a euphemism for the establishment, just a different word. It's also known as a shadow government. And it's my contention that he was put into power, quote unquote power. He was put into the presidency, we'll say, instead, to give the illusion that he was against the establishment or against the deep state and that he was going to root them out. The reason that he was chosen was because of the preponderance of information that has been unveiled about the existence of the establishment. People came to be aware of the fact that politicians were serving someone else. They were serving a group of people who have been traditionally hidden from the public, and to most people still they are hidden, but more and more people have become aware because we are on the cusp of the information age, moved from the Piscean age of I believe or blind faith into the information whose keywords are I know. So those things during this period of time that had been hidden are now being revealed. So the fact that information has been coming out about the existence of these groups of people who have been behind the scenes controlling affairs, it became necessary to divert people's attention, to give people the illusion that someone is working on behalf of the people to root out these controlling influences. Thus, the populist movement of Donald Trump, who has somehow deluded people into believing, because they want to believe, that he's ridding the world or the United States of those international interests known as the deep state, because as Fox Mulder said in the X-Files, I want to believe. Unfortunately for them and for us, nothing could be further from the truth. He is deeply ensconced in the swamp. He's part of the deep state or the establishment, and we've documented that to be true. But we will continue to do so. And I recall that prior to our beginning this series, we had gone into discussions about the origin of the conflict in the Middle East, which continues, as we know. It's escalated from just the war in Palestine between the state of Israel and the Palestinians, who were there, of course, before the state was founded. And as we went through that, we went through a book by a gentleman named Benjamin Friedman, who referred to himself as a Reformed Jew who was illuminating the things that, and I'll refer to them henceforth as Zionists. But he was illuminating the fact that back even before World War One, that these forces were behind the scenes manipulating governments. He discussed how they influenced the United States to be engaged in both wars. He identified those who convinced the United States to engage in the wars, how they were manipulated into helping to support the founding of Israel. And there was also a section in the book which I, at the time, felt was too gory, too shocking, that I didn't even address it in the air, but he alluded to these dark rituals that the Zionists had been engaging in, which also involved torturing of children. And it was his contention that that was one of the main reasons that they were considered pariahs in Europe, which ended up giving rise for the need of a founding of a homeland for them, because they were not welcome in the countries that they inhabited in Europe. Before reading Benjamin Friedman's book, I was under the impression that the sole impression that the reason that they were unwanted in those countries was because they had typically taken control of the European economies. They had become bankers and merchants. And because of the dominance that they had over the economies, and the fact that they kept to themselves and established themselves strongly, but became like a separate society within those countries. My research to that point, before reading Benjamin Friedman's book, had been the impression that they were unwanted because of the control that they had over the economies, which uh, at times became strangling. But reading his book, which was entitled Facts Are Facts, and I encourage you to get that book. He talks about the fact that throughout Europe, they began to be expelled from those European countries because they had been identified as having engaged in the ritual torturing of children. Now, why do I bring that up now? Because that continues to be relevant to this day based upon the information that we've begun to learn about with the activities that convicted and uh, convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein, who, based upon the information that's come out by him, had not only engaged in sex with underage children, but there was also information that those children were also using similar rituals to that which the Zionists who Benjamin Friedman discussed were involved in as well. So there seems to be a connection. As we went through the information in the previous shows, we talked about the connections that led up to this current period. We talked about people like Roy Cohn, who operated a blackmail ring which seemed to be quite eerily similar to that which Epstein was engaged in, that he seemed to be fond of underage boys, and similarly had sex parties, which also gave him the opportunity to use as blackmail information, because he's similar to how Jeffrey Epstein operates or operated. Also have surveillance equipment and gather that information to be able to have leverage over people who participated, one of which included former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. We talked about how Jeffrey Epstein was connected to Robert Maxwell, a former Mossad agent, and that he was likely a Mossad agent as well. We talked about the connections between Leslie Wexner, who helped to finance Jeffrey Epstein. We talked about the connections that Jeffrey Epstein had, finally, to the Rothschild family. And in early episodes of our series, Donald Trump Outside Our Establishment, we also identified Trump's connection to the Rothschild family. So all these things are converging, and they center around the same core group of people. In earlier shows that were not focused on the Donald Trump connections, following in some of Brother Steve Coakley's work, we talked about, uh, just to provide uh, the foundation. We talked briefly about the Roundtable Group that was founded by Cecil Rhodes and Lord Rothschild. And we talked about how Lord Rothschild, along with another member of the Roundtable Group, Lord Balfour, were involved in the founding of Israel. Okay, now you'll notice the link between all of these organizations and the things that are going on right now. Uh, and just for a current affairs update, we just learned that Trump has agreed to a 2-week ceasefire with Iran if the Strait of Hormuz is to be reopened. And prior to that, Trump had threatened to end the civilization of Iran. Uh, Something that just is really a sick and demented thing to say, that he would just destroy a civilization. But apparently that's on hold. I would suggest that the war is not going as expected. But I wanted to point out, for everyone who is listening, that these things are all connected. Okay, so I'm going to start by continuing on with the information that I've been compiling. And so we'll bring forward an article that I found. This article we see here, it's called "This is Not a New World Order. This is a No World Order." This is written by this organization, or published by this organization, called Collective Evolution, written by a woman named Sarah Finzoyer. And we'll read this into the record. And she's kind of going back in history a little bit. And I believe this person that she's referring to, and this was published on March 17th. The person she's referring to here is Rabbi Meir Kahane, who, if I'm not mistaken, was one of the founders of the JDL, or the Jewish Defense League. Okay, the article says, in 1989, terrorist Rabbi Meir Kahane made a promise. A horrible world war is coming. Kahane told journalist Robert I. Friedman, tens of millions will die. It will be the apocalypse. God will punish us for forsaking him. but we must have faith. The Messiah will come. There will be a resurrection of the dead. All the things that Jews believed in before they got so damn sophisticated. The amount of suffering we endure will depend upon what we do between now and the end. Kahane did not live to see his vision realized. In 1990, the year Friedman published The False Prophet, Rabbi Meir Kahane, from FBI informant to Knesset member, which is important because we've talked about the links between the intelligence community, organized crime, and the Zionist interests. From FBI informant to Knesset member, and Knesset, I believe, is the cabinet of the state of Israel. The 58-year Kahane was shot to death while giving a speech imploring American Jews to move to Israel. The alleged assailant, Egyptian-American El Sayed Nosair, was acquitted by a jury but sentenced by the judge. Wow. In death as in life, the circumstances surrounding Kahane are murky and violent. Friedman had an eye for figures of the 20th century who would define the 21st. 10 years after The False Prophet, he had published Red Mafia, his investigation of a transnational crime syndicate whose members came from the USSR and spent the 1990s infiltrating governments and corporations worldwide. The head of that syndicate, Semyon Mogilevich, put a contract on Friedman's life. Mind you, we've talked about as well the connection between the Zionists and the USSR and the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republic, was initiated by a coup by Zionists who launched an operation against the Tsar of Russia to establish the Soviet Union. Again, connections. Death threats were nothing new for Friedman. He had been getting them from Israelis ever since he wrote the Kahane biography. Friedman had also angered the FBI by claiming that they could have prevented the 1993 World Trade Center attacks and correctly warning years in advance that the towers would be attacked again. Wary of institutional constraints, Friedman embraced the Friedman of a freelancer. In 2002, Friedman died of cardiac arrest. He was 51. He never saw the future he worked so hard to stop. Red Mafia gained a cult following during Trump's first term. The book elucidates the structure of Trump's life and presidency. I may need to get that book. A merger of organized crime, white-collar crime, and government by criminals who elude, then rewrite borders and laws. Some blame Russia for the U.S. downfall, some blame Israel, but it was always both, along with American collaborators and assorted global operatives. Again, when you talk about Russia and you talk about Israel, you're essentially talking about the same people, because the same people founded both of those countries. And it's not Russia. It was the Soviet Union, which basically is, though it is no longer the Soviet Union, it's still controlled by the same people. Red Mafia names key villains and locales in mind. Oh, the other thing I was going to mention. These are the same organizations and groups of people that Whitney Webb discussed and identified in her book, One Nation Under Blackmail. Red Mafia names key villains and locales, including Trump Tower, which functioned as a dormitory for organized crime. Mogilevich became an early investor in Trump Tower after fleeing the USSR by getting an Israel passport in 1988 rather, from Robert Maxwell, the father of Jeffrey Epstein's partner Ghislaine. To save Red Mafia is timeless is to acknowledge that we've been frozen in hell for 40 years. The false prophet, on the other hand, is largely ignored. It is in demand but hard to find. Used copies of the out of print books sell for over $100. I bought mine before the Kahani acolytes returned to power in Israel. I've been wanting to write about the false prophet for years. I held back since it scares me more than any other book. If it were only history, I would not be so frightened. But the false prophet describes current events, the extremism that Kahani espoused and Friedman documented, now dominates Israel and in turn the United States. She says, I was born during the Iranian Revolution. As a result, I spent my entire life listening to U.S. officials call for war with Iran. In Israel, the calls are even louder, drowning out the reasonable voices who know such a war would be apocalyptic. The architects of the Iran war know that too, but don't care. Elderly fanatics from Netanyahu to Elliot Abrams, an Iran-Contra villain who served in nearly every administration of my life, understand that the time to see their goals reach fruition is running out. Trump is not the architect of the Iran war, only its vehicles. The coalition of forces allows us to do what I have yearned to do for 40 years, Netanyahu said as the war began, thanking the United States, my friend, U.S. President Donald Trump, and the U.S. military. It becomes more clear who's pulling Trump's strings. And mind you, it's not Netanyahu, because he serves someone as well. Side note. Netanyahu now says openly what he has said behind closed doors in 2001. America is a thing you can move very easily. One cannot understand the Iran war without understanding the Kahanists. I rarely see analysts mention them. Maybe they did, and it was behind a paywall. If a war crime is subscription only, doesn't make a sound. Does that sound a stifled scream? Meyer Kahani was a terrorist. The New York-based Kahani became an Orthodox rabbi before working as an undercover informant for the FBI to spy on Black Americans, whom he obsessively hated, believing, as Friedman writes, that Black demands for equality would somehow sabotage Jewish achievements. In 1970, Kahani and his followers plotted to mass murder the Black residents of Crown Heights. In his spare time, Kahani worked secretly for the CIA to promote the Vietnam War and partnered with Italian-American mafia head Joseph Colombo. The union between Kahani and Colombo was brokered by mob lawyer Barry Slotnick, who later brokered another union, the prenup for Donald and Melania Trump. Before I go on, I want to go back to that prior paragraph where it talks about Kahani and working as an undercover informant to spy on Black Americans. I want to point out that our dear brother, who's now an ancestor, Brother Steve Coakley, jousted with a member of the JDL, the Jewish Defense League, on Frontline. I forgot the guy's name, but I would encourage you to go and look at Steve Coakley's videos, you'll learn quite a bit about the relationship between blacks and Jews and how that relationship uh, basically underscores what she says in this paragraph, which basically underscores their interest in black people and how the so-called relationship between blacks and Jews in this country have operated, but it's operated under that very premise that Friedman identified here, that black demands for equality will somehow sabotage Jewish achievements. So that relationship was based upon that premise in such a way that they have always controlled black organizations or Negro organizations, such as the NAACP, such as our historically black colleges, and so on. But I encourage you to watch some of Steve Coakley's videos and lectures on that subject. And possibly, actually, before I came on, I was giving strong consideration to playing some of Steve Coakley's video, but we'll save that for another time. So let's go on with this article. So in his spare time, Kahani worked secretly for the CIA to promote the Vietnam War and partnered with Italian mafia head Joseph Colombo. The union between Kahani and Colombo was brokered by mob lawyer Barry Slotnick, who later brokered another union, the prenup for Donald and Melania Trump. In 1968, Kahani formed the Jewish Defense League, that was right, with the stated goal of combating anti-Semitism. The reality was violence. The JDL carried out bombings, shootings, and other acts of terror under the guidance of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, a veteran of the Zionist terrorist group Lehi. Kahani was popular with New York Jewish businessmen who sought, as Friedman relays, to do something about the N-words. They showered the JDL with money. Now, I think it's also important to note that the Jewish Defense League was not the only Jewish organization that was found to be spying on the black community. The Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, was also identified as having spied on the black community, and we found great evidence back in the 90s that they were doing so on black organizations in Los Angeles, including some that I was a part of. In 1971, Kahani, convicted for manufacturing explosives, fled to Israel, a path his murderous American acolytes would emulate in the decades to come. And as you know, I contend that that's what happened with Epstein, as opposed to him being committing suicide in prison. I think we may read an article that suggests the same thing. He started his own political party, Koch, and turned his wrath on Arabs, seeking to drive Palestinians out of Israel. And as Israel expanded, all Arabs out of existence. Kahane was a genocidaire. It is grimly ironic that he coined the phrase "never again," a phrase invoked by people who oppose genocide anywhere, but which Kahane meant to apply exclusively to the Holocaust and its Jewish victims, something that seems to continue to this day, that they only are concerned about the Holocaust committed against the Jewish people when and downplay genocide that has been committed against others. At first, Israel welcomed Kahane, but in 1984, at first Israel welcomed Kahane. In 1984, he was elected to the Knesset, but many Israelis rejected his policies, which included a ban on Jewish-Gentile relations and perpetual warfare against neighboring countries, and his methods blowing things up. By 1987, only 21% of Israelis approved of his views. In 1988, Israel banned Koch for racism, and the FBI allegedly turned against their informant, allegedly. In response, Kahane renounced his U.S. citizenship but continued to visit until he died. His legacy endured. In 1994, Kahane's Baruch Goldstein murdered 29 Palestinians worshiping at a mosque in Hebron. Later that year, Israel declared Koch a terrorist organization. In 1997, the U.S. added the group to its terror watch list. Koch remained on the U.S. terror watch list until 2022, when Biden removed it. I'll repeat that one more time. When Biden removed it. Okay, so let's make this clear. This series on Trump has absolutely nothing to do with politics. We are not taking sides, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal. That's just an illusion game for pawns. Both sides are controlled by the same people. So don't come at me talking to politics. That's just for the juveniles. Koch remained on the U.S. terror list until May 2022 when Biden removed it. The removal was ominous. The Biden administration claimed the group was inactive, but nothing could be further from the truth. The Kahanis were now in the Knesset. They had regrouped under new names but never changed their fascist ideology. In 2021, Netanyahu, who like Trump was indicted and widely disliked, built a new political coalition out of the remains of Koch. He found support in a younger generation of Kahanis who celebrate genocide and align with white supremacists. The coalition includes Itamar Ben-Gvir, a leader of the fascist Atzma Yehudit Party, who led the Koch movement as a teenager in the 1990s. Much as the second Trump administration is more extreme than the first. Netanyahu's return to power was made possible by a coalition of once derided fanatics who exult in violence. Wow, parallel. Under prior U.S. terrorism rules, Kahanis like Ben-Gvir would have been sanctioned. Thanks to the Biden administration, they operate freely, meeting with evangelical extremists like Speaker of the House Mike Johnson. Following the October 7th attack, the U.S. showered Israel with a record amount of money and backed the ensuing genocide of Palestinians. Now, under Trump, the USA is the most extreme government in Israeli history in one of its oldest plans, war on Iran, and one older than that, the end of the world. By the 1970s, Kahani was victored, excuse me, by the 1970s, Kahani was convinced that he was destined to usher in the Messianic age. While proclaiming all Jews to be the chosen people, we are not equal to the Gentiles. We are different. We are higher, he said. Some Jews were more chosen than others. At the top of God's list, according to Kahani, was Kahani. Kahani was swept up in a kind of messianic passion, Friedman recounts in The False Prophet. Words like apocalypse, redemption, and Messiah took over his political vocabulary. The JDL was rapidly evolving into a fundamentalist code with Kahani, like some medieval Kabbalists, twisting and turning the Torah to explain why expelling the Arabs would usher in the Messiah. Americans may find this rhetoric familiar. Several high-ranking U.S. officials have proclaimed themselves chosen for office by God instead of U.S. voters. I think Trump said that as well. Though a varied face, they all believe their duty is to serve Israel. They serve Israel at the expense of the American people, both their tax money and their peace of mind. Among them are Mike Johnson, who said a state visit to Israel was a fulfillment of a biblical prophecy. Chuck Schumer, who told the New Yorker he was placed in the Senate by God to protect Israel. Former Trump Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who based foreign policy around the rapture. And of course, Trump, who said that Israeli Jews view him as the king of Israel and the second coming of God. Trump was told that he was a Jewish Messiah by Lev Parnas, a felon with ties to organized crime who has since reinvented himself as an anti-Trump pundit. Parnas' declaration was based on Jewish gematria and made in a conversation that Trump was not aware was recorded. Parnas gave Trump a gift from rabbis in Ukraine and Israel and encouraged Trump to ask Jared Kushner, whose criminal family had been friends with the criminal Netanyahu family for decades, for clarification. Trump seemed unmoved by his divine destiny. The Messiah, after all, is an unpaid position. More mysterious is why Parnas, a transnational criminal until he was caught, and his son came to be leading operatives for the Democratic Party during Biden's term. That seems spectacularly unwise, but then again, doesn't anything. Again, politics is an illusion. Americans have a history of basing policy on the apocalypse. One could ostensibly date it back to the Puritans. But extremism became sharper after Reagan's embrace of the far right. Cabinet officials like James G. Watt, for example, opposed environmental protection because the end was nigh, might as well drill. The younger George Bush allegedly spoke of the end-time prophecy of Gog and Magog, while his cabinet framed the invasion of Iraq as a holy war. Whether they believed it matters less than that they got the catastrophic result that they desired. No country benefited from that catastrophe more than Israel. In 1982, Oded Yanon, an advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, devised a plan for Greater Israel, an Israel that subsumes 6 surrounding states, stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. For decades, Greater Israel and the Yanon plan were dismissed by Israeli officials as anti-Semitic myths. The idea that Israel is not pursuing Greater Israel would be more convincing had Israeli officials not put emblems of Greater Israel on IDF uniforms, invaded Lebanon, and proclaimed it part of Greater Israel. Announced that Israel would also conquer Jordan and parts of Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq, and call that Greater Israel. Made a Greater Israel amulet for Netanyahu and displayed maps of Greater Israel that excludes Palestinians. whom Netanyahu calls Amalek, while declaring their fate is to be slain. Wow. The idea of Greater Israel dates back to Theodore Herzl, who we discussed in our past discussion about the origin of the conflict in the so-called Middle East. The idea of Greater Israel dates back to Theodore Herzl, the father of Zionism, but Yonan devised its borders for the post-World War II era. In 2007, Wesley Clark, a U.S. general who opposed the Iraq War, recalled that 10 days after 9/11, he was given a memo on how we were going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. Over the next 25 years, every country on that list was a target of the United States and Israeli military incursions. Now in 2026, we arrive at a full-fledged attack on Iran from the most autocratic regimes in both Israel and modern U.S. history, regimes that respect neither international law nor the sanctity of human life and no longer make a pretense of doing so. Regimes that seek to destroy the world while wrapping themselves in the mantles of piety and prophecy. For Zionist Israel, the goal is clear: the fulfillment of the Greater Israel agenda. Iran has long been an obstacle to that agenda by funding regional militia groups that oppose Israel and by declaring itself Israel's steadfast enemy. That Israel's government is bad does not make Iran's government good. Iran's government commits massive human rights violations, including the slaughter of protesters, but that is not why Israel attacks it, nor is it the reason that the United States attacks it. They attack Iran because it's in the way. For the U.S., the motive is questionable. Not to me. They're doing the bidding of Israel. For there is no domestic benefit to an Iran war. Right. After the disastrous Iraq war, the U.S. regained international respect for about 5 minutes in 2009, when in a fit of delirium, international observers awarded Barack Obama for the Nobel Peace Prize for not being George W. Bush. And they're saying that tongue in cheek because Barack Obama didn't deserve the Nobel Peace Prize because he initiated his own wars as well, including killing Gaddafi and throwing Libya into a state of disarray. Thank you, Barack Obama. Obama went on to pursue war. Obama went on to pursue war under a different name, though. Drone strikes and administrative protection of corrupt. Obama went on to pursue war under a different name through drone strikes and administrative protection of corrupt financiers. Obama was followed by Trump, who horrified allies and pleased dictators in proportion to their relative sadism. Then Biden, who backed a genocide, and once again, Trump, now an American autocrat tasked with carrying out the long-planned action on Iran. Now, mind you, we read into the record presidents from both parties all executing the same plan, all following the same orders. So please, please, please wake up and stop falling for the political illusion. There is a myth that the Iran war is driven by Christian nationalism. The myth is so powerful that it spurred articles about events that never occurred, like a debunked narrative from an apparent huckster, Mikey Weinstein, claiming that the Pentagon told troops that they were fighting to bring Armageddon on behalf of a Christ like Trump. The most disturbing part of this narrative, besides that it went viral despite being fabricated, is that it reflects wishful thinking. There are American Christian nationalist fanatics who see the Iran war as a holy war and wish their faith were the central concern. And those are people who are much more, are the most easily manipulated. But more influential are ultra Zionist hawks like Elliot Abrams. They never recovered from the Iranian Revolution and have sought revenge since 1979. In the 1980s, some of these alleged foes of Iran worked out their complicated feelings by making illicit weapons deals to supply Nicaraguan death squads. And do refer to Gary Webb's book, who goes into that in great detail. Brother Jamal, remind me what the title of Gary Webb's book, if you would. Christian nationalism is not the main motivation for the Iran war, nor is it about Trump's desire for autocratic consolidation. The war impedes it given its massive unpopularity. Nor is it a distraction from the Epstein files. I'll get to that. And Gary Webb's book is called Dark Alliance. Highly recommended reading to give you better, deeper context. Christian nationalism is not the main motivation for the Iran war. Thank you, Brother Jamal. Nor is it about Trump's desire for autocratic consolidation. The war impedes it given its massive unpopularity, nor is it a distraction from the Epstein files. I'll get to that. Nor is it about Trump's desire for Middle East peace. I'll get to that when I stop laughing. The Iran war is being fought for greater Israel, correct, and for annihilation. The doctrine of annihilation is not unitary. Christian fanatics, Jewish fanatics, secular accelerationists, and techno-fascists seeking depopulation all have their own agendas. There is a desire to usher in the Messianic age, but that gets tricky when competing messiahs in play. The only certainty is in carnage in the Middle East, possibly culminating in the destruction of Al-Aqsa Mosque and the building of a third temple, a goal shared by bear with me for a moment. There you go. A goal shared by Jewish and Christian extremists, though the extremists diverge radically in what they think happens once their preferred Messiah shows up. That horrifies Muslims worldwide and would expand the war to multiple fronts. This is not a new world order. This is a no world order. In 1973, Senator J. William Fulbright went on TV and announced that the U.S. Senate had become a subsidiary of Israel. Ooh. That's back in 1973. Let me read that again. In 1973, Senator J. William Fulbright went on TV and announced that the U.S. Senate had become a subsidiary of Israel. I would encourage listeners to look at the politicians who are currently in Congress and determine what percentage of them have taken donations from AIPAC. And that will give you the information to be able to validate that comment. He said the Senate is subservient to Israel. In my opinion, much too much. We should be more concerned about the United States' interests rather than doing the bidding of Israel. This is a most unusual development. The great majority of the Senate of the United States, somewhere around 80%, are completely in support of Israel. I would say that would be about 95% now. Remember, this was written in 1973. The great majority of the Senate of the United States, somewhere around 80%, are completely in support of Israel, anything Israel wants. This has been demonstrated time and time again, and was the case in the past, in the most recent presidential election, where both candidates pledged their fealty to Israel. This has been demonstrated time and again, and this has made it difficult for our government. His statement was controversial then and uncomfortable now, but accurate. Funding Israel is the only issue on which Congress unites, even when it is to the detriment of the United States. AIPAC is a near universal donor. See, AIPAC is a near universal donor to U.S. politicians on both sides of the aisle, and Israel's spyware steps in whenever folks get feisty. As a side note, I had not read this article before we went live today. I just kind of briefed over it. So I'm finding this article to be very, very much on point. Fulbright was worried about the Jackson Amendment that would allow Jewish immigration from the U.S., from the USSR to the U.S. I'll read that again. Remember what I said about the USSR. Fulbright was worried about the Jackson Amendment that would allow Jewish immigration from the USSR to the U.S. This was one of the causes Kahane proclaimed to care about most while carrying out terror campaigns that had nothing to do with it. When the amendment passed, it allowed innocent Soviet Jews facing oppression to find freedom abroad. Unfortunately, it also allowed Mogilevich and other mobsters to get to the U.S., where they made their fortunes with partners like Donald Trump. And remember, many of those partners were Zionists, which actually she's going into. Excellent. Trump came of political age in the 1970s. You'll remember some of these names that we discussed before. Trump came of political age in the 1970s, New York of Meyer Kahane. He was mentored by mafia lawyer Roy Cohn, who I mentioned at the beginning of the show, a secular Zionist who partnered with other Zionists, Jewish and Christian, in pursuit of money and power. Cohn, like Netanyahu, would engage in anti-Semitism against other Jews in order to achieve his goals. Like Kahane, they recognized Israel's utility as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Mafiosos hightailed it to Israel when RICO or sanctions rolled in. Keep that in mind when we discuss Epstein. Mafiosos hightailed it to Israel when RICO or sanctions rolled in. JDL terrorists found sanctuary in Israel after committing brutal murders like the 1985 assassination of Palestinian-American interfaith peace activist Alex O'Day. Trump's father, Fred Trump, became friends with Netanyahu. Ooh, I didn't know that. Trump's father, Fred Trump, became friends with Netanyahu in the 1980s, when Netanyahu was Israel's ambassador to the UN. The friendship extended to Donald. Donald's closeness to Netanyahu grew stronger when Ivanka Trump married Jared Kushner, whose family was so close with the Netanyahus that Netanyahu used to sleep in Jared's bed when Jared was not in it. Jared Kushner works closely with Netanyahu and brokers foreign deals for the United States, despite not being a member of the Trump administration. No one in Congress does anything meaningful to stop him. That's true. An unelected son-in-law carrying out the will of an autocrat is typical in a kleptocracy. The unusual part is that Kushner is not working for the country for which his father-in-law is president. Yeah, as Brother Steve Coakley would say, check. Trump is not in control of the Iran war. Netanyahu is, and Kushner is his lackey. Trump enjoys violence but is wary of war. War is unpredictable, and Trump cannot function in an unscripted reality for too long. He likes overseas attacks to be one and done, a dramatic plot twist in the season finale of his reality TV presidency. Kidnap the president of Venezuela, drop a Moab on Afghanistan. Why? To show he can. The quagmire war is another matter, one Trump wishes to avoid, too messy, too boring, and too likely to wrest control from him to others. Thus, the 2-week peace, the 2-week truce. Trump's propensity for one and done overseas attacks should stoke fear. There's an obvious and terrible way to do a one and done on Iran. Trump likely hopes killing Ayatollah Khamenei is enough to satisfy Israel, along with the international coalition of scumbags who make their own trades and investments with an Iran war in mind. Given the plans for greater Israel, dead Ayatollah is unlikely to suffice. The Iran war may not prove a Trumpian season finale, but a serious finale for Earth. Though much has been made of Iran's desire for nuclear weapons, the only countries in this war that surely have them are the US and Israel. True. Israel spent decades denying that its nuclear program existed. It locked up whistleblowers like Mordecai Vanunu, who made the mistake of giving documents proving the weapon's existence to the Daily Mirror, not realizing that Robert Maxwell, who owned the Mirror, was not a British media magnate, but an espionage operative for Israel. Vanunu was kidnapped. Bear with me. Vanunu was kidnapped by Mossad and thrown in an Israeli prison. This is the same Robert Maxwell who sired Ghislaine and played a role in the Ryan Contra scandal with Trump pals like arms trader Adnan Khashoggi, a relative of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist who was murdered allegedly with Kushner's approval to please his friend, Saudi leader MBS. The same families appear again and again in a transnational crime network that profits off war. Many reacted to the Iran war by proclaiming it a distraction from the Epstein files. Aside from the grotesque nature of declaring the mass murder of civilians, including children, a distraction, the Iran war can only remind one of Epstein and Maxwell, for many of the same people tied to them are also tied to this war. Correct. It reminds people that Israel slaughters girls and the Epstein operation rapes them, and the United States abets both. Did the partial release of the Epstein files push Trump into a war he would rather avoid? Possibly. Trump usually does not need to be blackmailed into evil. He's a volunteer. He is largely incapable of shame. Anything that controls him has to be worse than what has been revealed. Given Netanyahu's half-century of close ties to Trump and Kushner, Epstein's ties to Trump, and Maxwell's connection to Israel, it is likely if anyone has that kind of blackmail, Israel does. Check. This does not rule out other countries from having it as well. Double check. And I contend that Russia does have that type of information and leverage for reasons that we've discussed already. How does this end? In Trump's mind, the one and done attack may be nuking Iran, Trump has been obsessed with nuclear weapons since the 1980s and expressed a belief that the world will end in nuclear war. In 1984, he said that Roy Cohn wanted him to study nukes for his future. Trump's trepidation turned to intrigue in 2016 when, while running for office, he said, "If we have them, why can't we use them?" Trump may cope with this fear and elation by being the one who can push the button. In ideal circumstances, rational power brokers who would do everything they could to curtail this catastrophe. But Trump is surrounded by warmongers like Netanyahu who have spent decades planning an Iran war. They are not going to stop now. Netanyahu's own power relies on Kahanists who see committing mass murder as part of their divinely mandated destiny. In the U.S., Christian nationalists like Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth applaud the war, along with Kushners. Some in Kushner's sect think the Iran war means Mosaic is on his way. Over the past decade, operatives built a narrative to present Trump as an arbiter of an apocalyptic and messianic age. The least convincing participant has been Trump, a void of a man who now may feel he has no choice but to strike the final blow. The tragedy is that it's the rest of the world that is out of options, other than to show our opposition, retain our moral code, and help each other. The best we can. Robert Friedman concluded the false prophet with this warning. Between now and an apocalypse that Kahani could well trigger, world Jewry should come to terms with how powerful a force Jewish fundamentalists like Kahani have become, and then do something to stop them before they destroy Israel and poison the future of Jewish people. That too is up to us. Friedman was Jewish and wrote out of heartache for the future he foresaw. His investigations of terrible people were motivated by compassion for those who do not deserve to suffer under their sway. That includes people of every ethnicity and creed. We can no longer prevent an Iran war, but we can shine light on the past and let the facts inform the present. I wish officials had heeded Friedman's warnings in 1990 when I was a child. I wish they at least tried. There are children who need us to try now. There is reason enough to do right, regardless of all that has gone wrong. Again, written by Sarah Kinzoyer. Okay. All right, we're going to, actually, I want to bring this up real quick. Now, we mentioned Roy Cohn, and I just want to bring this back into focus. And we've talked about this before, but again, just to put things back into context. The Roy Cohn machine. Roy Cohn was only at the beginning of his career when he waded his way into the underground sexual blackmail ring, apparently led by Louis Rosenstiel. Indeed, when Cohn first met Hoover, and that's J. Edgar Hoover, former head of the FBI, he was only 23 years old. Over the next 3 decades or so before his death from AIDS-related complications in 1986 at the age of 56, Cohn built a well-oiled machine largely through his close friendships with some of the country's most influential figures. Amongst Cohn's friends were top media personalities like Barbara Walters, former CIA directors Ronald Reagan and wife Nancy, media moguls Rupert Murdoch and Mark Zuckerman, numerous celebrities, prominent lawyers like Alan Dershowitz, who defended Jeffrey Epstein, top figures in the Catholic Church, and leading Jewish organizations like B'nai B'rith, mind you, the Anti-Defamation League, who we discussed earlier, is part of B'nai B'rith, and the World Jewish Congress. Many of the same names that surrounded Cohn until death in the late 1980s would later come around to surround Jeffrey Epstein with their names appearing in Epstein's now infamous Little Black Book. Okay, just to kind of like tie things up a bit, I wanted to bring that to our attention. Yeah, we'll go on a little bit here. While Trump is clearly connected to both Epstein and Cohn, Cohn's network also extends to former President Bill Clinton, whose friend and longtime political advisor, Richard Dirty Dick Morris, was Cohn's cousin and close associate. Morris was also close to Clinton's former communications director, George Stephanopoulos, who was also associated with Jeffrey Epstein. Wow. Yet these were only Cohn's connections to respectable members of the establishment. He was also known for his deep connections to the mob and gained prominence, largely for his ability to connect key figures in the criminal underworld to respected influential figures acceptable to the public sphere. Ultimately, as New York Attorney John Klaus stated, Cohn's most powerful tool was blackmail, which he used against friend and foe, gangster or public official alike. How much of that blackmail he acquired through his sexual blackmail operation will likely never be known. Since part two of this exclusive investigation will reveal Cohn and Epstein and the sexual blackmail operations they ran share many things in common, including not only many of the same famous friends and patrons, but also connections to the intelligence agencies and consortiums of mob-lead businessmen, the modern-day equivalents of Samuel Bronfman and Louis Rosenstiel, who have since rebranded as philanthropists. This article is written by Whitney Webb. Okay, so we'll go back to Facebook. And going here because there are a number of articles that I set aside for us to pursue. Okay, this article here, we're going to briefly why Epstein linked elites facing consequences in Europe but not in the U.S. This is by Truth Theory, published on March 17th. Years after the Jeffrey Epstein scandal shocked the world, a striking contrast is becoming harder to ignore across Europe. Investigations, career collapses, and legal actions are still unfolding, while the United States accountability appears to have largely stalled. Yes, Ghislaine Maxwell is behind bars, but she was Epstein's closest associate, the central figure who helped run his network. The question many are now asking is simple: what about everyone else? Because if Maxwell was not operating alone, then where are the rest? In Europe, authorities seem far more willing to keep pulling the thread. In the UK, Prince Andrew lost his royal duties, military titles, and public role after the scandal. In France, Jean-Luc Brunel was arrested and investigated over trafficking allegations. Financial elites have also been hit with banker Just Staley banned from senior roles over his relationship with Epstein and misleading regulators. And it's not stopping. New investigations continue to emerge across Europe. Poland has opened fresh probes into trafficking links. France is expanding cases into financial crimes and corruption tied to Epstein's network. Even in Scandinavia, reports have surfaced that figures at the highest political level, including the former Norwegian prime minister, are being examined in connection with the wider network. Whether those investigations lead to charges or not is still unclear, but the key point is this: the process is still active. In the United States, by contrast, the momentum appears to have faded. Despite Epstein's vast network of powerful connections spanning billionaires, politicians, academics, and celebrities, there's been no wave of high-profile criminal prosecutions, no cascade of arrests, no broad unraveling of the network. Instead, what followed was something very different. Banks paid large settlements, Wealthy individuals stepped down from positions. Lawsuits were quietly resolved. Reputations were damaged, but the legal consequences in most cases stopped there. Critics argue that this reflects a deeper issue within the U.S. system, the tendency for elite networks to absorb scandals rather than fully expose them. Many point back to Epstein's controversial 2007 non-prosecution deal in Florida, a moment that arguably protected not just Epstein, but the wider circle around him. By the time the full scale of the operation had become public years later, key evidence, witnesses, and momentum had already been lost. And there is the unanswered question that continues to fuel speculation. How does a network this large, disconnected, and this documented can result in so few prosecutions? Europe, at least for now, appears to be treating the case as unfinished. The United States, on the other hand, looks to many observers like it has already moved on. And I think we just discussed in the prior article why that might be so. And we will conclude with this article here, which I had alluded to earlier. This one goes into the alleged death by suicide of Jeffrey Epstein and some of the strange information surrounding his alleged suicide. This article is from Doggo Dreamscape, published on March 17th of this year. Epstein's suicide, quote unquote, gets even stranger. New docs reveal fake body made from boxes and sheets loaded on white van to fool paparazzi. Real body slipped away in a black vehicle. I don't know if it's going to mention this, but there was an inmate at the prison who spoke on this anonymously. He was in fear, but he made the point that he had observed some strange things going on the day that Epstein allegedly committed suicide. The Epstein saga twists into nightmare territory. Newly unsealed documents from the Metropolitan Correctional Center reveal a chilling deception right after his 2019 suicide, quote unquote. Guards allegedly crafted a fake body from cardboard boxes and draped sheets, then loaded the makeshift corpse into a white medical examiner's van to draw the swarm of paparazzi and reporters waiting outside. While cameras flashed and followed that decoy exit, the real body of Jeffrey Epstein was quietly slipped away in a low-profile black vehicle, vanishing unnoticed into the chaos. This bizarre media misdirection, detailed in internal memos and FBI interview notes from recent file releases, fuels endless questions. Why go to such elaborate lengths to hide the movement of one prisoner's remains? Was it mere crowd control or something far more sinister to conceal? See details below. The death of Jeffrey Epstein in August 2019 has remained one of the most controversial and widely debated events in criminal history. Official reports conclude that Epstein died by suicide while being held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. However, years after his death, newly unsealed documents and internal records have revived questions about what happened in the chaotic hours following the discovery of his body. According to recently surfaced internal memos and interview notes linked to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, investigators documented an unusual claim about how prison staff handled this situation outside the jail that night. The records describe an alleged strategy used to manage the intense media attention surrounding the case, one that involved what appeared to be a deliberate diversion. At the time of Epstein's death, journalists, photographers, and television crews had already gathered in large numbers outside the facility because the financier had been facing serious federal charges related to sex trafficking. His death immediately became global news. Authorities were aware that any movement involving his body would likely trigger a massive media response. According to the notes, guards allegedly assembled a makeshift decoy meant to resemble a body. The documents claim that cardboard boxes were stacked and wrapped in sheets to imitate a human form placed on a stretcher. This improvised figure was reportedly loaded into a white medical examiner's van positioned outside the jail. As expected, the vehicle quickly drew the attention of reporters and photographers waiting outside the building. Cameras flashed while media crews followed the van, believing it was transporting Epstein's remains. During that same period, the documents suggest that the real body was quietly removed from the facility in a separate black vehicle with a much lower profile. If accurate, the alleged tactic allowed officials to move Epstein's remains away from the prison without attracting immediate public attention. Supporters of the explanation argue that such an approach may have been used simply to control crowds and reduce chaos during an extremely sensitive moment. High-profile cases sometimes require authorities to take unusual steps to maintain security and protect personnel. Nevertheless, the claims have added another layer of mystery. Nevertheless, the claims have added another layer of mystery to a case already surrounded by controversy. Epstein's death triggered widespread scrutiny because of earlier reports that security cameras near his cell malfunctioned and that guards assigned to monitor him had fallen asleep during their shift. These failures had already fueled speculation about whether standard procedures were properly followed. Critics argue that if a decoy operation truly occurred, it raises further questions about transparency and communication with the public. They ask why such a complicated method would be necessary and whether officials were attempting to avoid something more than just media attention. It's important to note that documents referenced in these reports describe investigative notes and internal discussions rather than confirmed findings. Authorities have not publicly verified the alleged decoy scenario, and no official investigation has concluded that such an operation took place. Even so, the newly revealed records illustrate why the Epstein case continues to capture public attention years after his death. With powerful connections, unanswered questions, and a long trail of controversy, the circumstances surrounding Jeffrey Epstein remain one of the most debated mysteries in recent criminal history. Okay, so I will leave it there. That's some food for thought. I do not believe that Epstein killed himself, certainly. He either was murdered because he was no longer useful and had possibly become a liability, or he was extracted and exiled to Israel as other people who were of similar ilk were allowed to do. So I will leave it there for today. I hope that you found this informative. I certainly have. And I'm sorry to burst some people's bubble who feel that politics, if only the right people were put in place in the political realm, all would be made right. I do not believe that to be the case, because those who end up in prominent positions in either party ultimately will be controlled and are and have been controlled by the Israel lobby, principle of which is AIPAC. So they're not working for our interests. So no liberation is coming from there. Sorry. All right. So hope you find this informative. I will point out again, we do this because it is our duty as spiritual people to shed light on darkness and to battle against darkness. We are to uphold Dharma and to fight against adharma. Dharma being that which is virtuous, and adharma is the opposite, unrighteousness. So spirituality, as I pointed out, is not an escape from life. It is a means for us to be able to deal with and navigate it effectively. I would like to be able to just do spiritual work, but this is part of the spiritual work. So, and that's why I'm equally spending attention on things that we're facing in the world today. We'll go back to spirituality again so that we don't lose sight of our ultimate purpose here, and that we continue on our path to enlightenment, path to our journeys into ourselves. Again, we live in two worlds simultaneously. We are spiritual beings living a human existence, and it's not for us to ignore one or the other. Is basically putting a proper priority to them and putting in to practice our spiritual principles so that we can more effectively navigate the physical world. So with that, I'll end. If you feel compelled to reach out to me for spiritual counsel, do visit my website, www.sa-ra.org, and we can set an appointment and go from there. So thank you for tuning in to Journey in the Self. We'll see you next time. What's up?